So we're going to start with Judy Chicago. Now, Judy Chicago was one of the pioneers of the feminist art movement in the 1970s, a movement that endeavored to reflect women's lives, call attention to women's roles as an artist, and alter the conditions under which contemporary art was produced and received. In the process, feminist art questioned the authority of the male-dominated Western canon of art and posed one of the most significant challenges to modernization, which was, at the time, wholly preoccupied with the conditions of formalism as opposed to personal narrative and political activity. What does that mean? What they're doing is they're questioning the Western canon, in this case, the canon of art history, how we look at art history and who we incorporate as the great artists of history. And under modernism, obviously we haven't quite gotten to postmodernism yet, but under modernism, the idea was that you focus on formalism, looking at the piece without worrying about the context of the artist or the history. And Judy Chicago's coming along and saying, no, that's not right. We need to look at the artist. We need to look at the historical context or the social context or the cultural context behind it. And that's where feminism starts to come in. She's seeking to redress women's traditional underrepresentation in the visual arts. She focused on female subject matter, which celebrates the achievements of women through history. She also scandalized audiences with her frank use of vaginal and vulvar imagery of the vulva. We'll go with that. In her work, Chicago employed the feminine arts, long relegated to the lowest rungs of the artistic hierarchy, things such as needlework, embroidery, ceramics. And some of these we don't necessarily think of as women's work today, but for a long time they were. For example, ceramics traditionally, especially ceramic painting, was seen as women's work or a woman's hobby. She also articulates her feminist vision not only as an artist, but also as an educator, an organizer. And we're going to see that a lot in artists as we move forward, where they're not just taking on that role of artist, which society grants them, but expands it and takes on that role of organizing movements or educating the public on these various causes. And most famously, Chicago creates Dinner Party. The Dinner Party is one of the most well-known pieces of feminist art in existence, and it is permanently housed at the Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum. This was at one time particularly controversial, although today we look at it and go, meh, but we also live in a time with the internet and things that weren't there in the 1970s. We're used to these ideas. We've had 50 years to get used to them. Whereas back then, not so much. The installation consists of a large banquet table with place settings for 39 notable women from history, as well as mythology. Each one, we have a chalice, we have some utensils, but then we have a plate, which is custom decorated for each person, and a place setting, which is also custom decorated for the person. So this one is for Wollstonecraft, a very famous woman of the 17th or 18th century in England. Now, as we look at each of these pieces, we have the porcelain plates, and the plates are usually decorated with either a butterfly or vulva type form, getting at that idea of gender identity. What does it mean to be a woman, and what did these women all have in common? And to Judy Chicago, what they have in common is their gender, and what's the best way to reflect that gender? To her, it's going to be images based on the vulva, or loosely hidden images based on butterflies, which also tend to reflect the vulva. So we're getting these ideas, and here we see Georgia O'Keeffe and Virginia Woolf as two versions. And then, in addition, we have 999 other women painted on the tiles below the triangular table. So these triangular tiles are painted with names. Here we see Pandora, but of course we see people from throughout history painted on there. And there's a purpose for this. There's a reason for this. It's supposed to set off a conversation. So as she creates this piece and she sets it out, it's not about the piece. No one's going to buy it. No one's going to sit there and go, yes, I have the Dinner Party by Judy Chicago. It's supposed to set off a conversation. And that conversation, as always, starts with, is it art? Second question is probably going to be something along the lines of, I wonder who Virginia Woolf is, or who Wollstonecraft is, or who Georgia O'Keeffe, or Sojourner Truth, or so many of these other people depicted at the table are. You're going to look at the names on the floor and see the same thing. And hopefully, where that conversation goes is you say, wow, there are a lot of people that I don't know about in history. And then it gets to a deeper truth. Think about it this way. How many of you, given 30 seconds, can name 10 famous men? Well, that's easy. That's cakewalk. You can walk through presidents, you can walk through Roman emperors, etc. But how many of you can name 10 famous women in the same 30 seconds? Well, that's going to be a lot harder. Now let's take it one step further. How many of you can name 5 male artists? Pretty easy. You go with the Ninja Turtles plus Brunelleschi, you're there. But how many of you can name 5 female artists? So she's trying to show how ignorant we are about women in history. She's doing it through her art with the hope that we're going to see some of those names and maybe we're going to pursue them. Maybe we're going to educate ourselves, try and learn about this specific person because, hey, I have no idea who they are. So this piece participates in the feminist revision of history initiated during the 1970s, in which feminists worked to rediscover lost role models for women, rewriting the past that had previously only included the male voice. In combination with intricately wrought tiles, textiles, and porcelain, Chicago reclaimed the realm of high art to include what had been traditionally relegated to the status of lower art or women's work. So she's showing, just like pop art will take comic books and things and make them high art, she's showing that these traditional female arts, needlework, embroidery, ceramic painting, should be seen as high art. And they have their place in that realm, even though they are primarily female or associated with the feminine.